Hey, how's everybody doing? Welcome to the first video lecture of the class for Chapter 1A. I see that we've got a pretty good audience waiting already. How's everybody doing today? If you've got your phone beside you, go ahead and send me a text saying hello. Let me know who's in my audience. Or if you want and you've got your Google login, you can actually log into the to Google and type in the chat bar, and your chat will appear on the screen later on when we get in the lecture. Before we get started, the one thing I wanted to good deal, we've got Needy Gandalia here. It's nice to see you, Needy. Good to see you. Okay, before we get started, I did want to talk about one thing. It looks like some of you still have not completed the course entry quiz. The course entry quiz is a fundamental part of being enrolled in this class. If you do not finish the course entry quiz by the time we get to the due date, which is in a couple of days, you will be disenrolled in this class, and there's nothing I'll be able to do for you. Okay, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do real quick is show you how to do that in case you don't know. Okay, so quickly we're going to go ahead and I think I'm going to share my screen. Okay, we got full screen right here. Boom. All right, when you get into the class, all you do is click up here in the left hand corner on course entry quiz. And there you are at the course entry quiz. I really don't care how well you do on this, how poorly you do. All I need you to do is to make sure that you have completed this course entry quiz, okay? No big deal. All right, I see a bunch of you are saying hello. It is good to see everybody here. Let's go ahead and get started with the lecture if you don't mind. Okay, so we are in Chapter 1. I'm getting some texts here. Looks like we have Donnie Hahn here saying hello. Good deal. Who else have we got? Sending hellos right now. Good deal. Who else have we got sending hellos? Whoa, I have to stop that. Excuse me. So what we got? Top chat. Let's get live chat here. We got Ashley Riddick here, Amanda Pickett, Alexander Gromley, KB Hoyle. Fantastic. Hi, Grace Coots. It's good to see you too. Fantastic. Thanks for everybody for showing up. This is really awesome. We got Madison Brigitis in the audience too. Good to see you. Fantastic. All right, I've wasted enough time on hellos and everything. Let's go ahead and get started with the lecture. All right. So today we're talking about Chapter 1. Basically what I want to do is try to introduce the science to you today. Why is psychology a science? What is it? Some of the early approaches to doing psychology, and then I quickly want to tell you what kind of psychologist I am and let you decide what kind of psychologist you want to be, because there are many different types. All right, so today we're going to talk about a definition of psychology, 3 people who are important in the beginnings of psychology, 3 basic approaches to looking at the human being, and what we would call the professional subfields of psychology that exist right now. Hopefully this lecture will help you complete your course homework. If you need any other help, don't hesitate to go to your textbook. That will also include some resources for you. I've included, I don't know if you've noticed, but I included a copy of the PowerPoint that I'm going to be going through today as an attachment on this lecture, so that you can follow along with that if you want. You know what? Let's see. Okay, so all right. So Chapter 1. Boom. Psychology. Turns out people have been thinking about what it means to be human for as long as we've had campfires, really. As long as we had time to sit around and talk about our day, people have talked about what it means to be human. So one way of thinking psychology is that it's the oldest discipline of study known to mankind. It's been talked about forever. In fact, in your psych textbook, as in most textbooks, they're going to include the early Greek psychologists as some of the early Greek philosophers as psychologists, and they're going to call them the proto-psychologists, right? Here's the deal, though. Psychology is not just thinking about the mind, but it's something else, too. It's about measuring the mind. So while psychology is probably one of the oldest thoughtful endeavors in the world. It's one of the newer sciences in the world. And that's because we've only recently learned how to approach the study of the mind in a scientific manner. Now, Chris, what does it mean to be scientific? It means that you make measurements and observation. Philosophers didn't really make observations. They did what we would call thought experiments. They would describe things and talk about things and sort of work through problems in their mind. But working through a problem in your mind is not the same as measuring that problem. And psychology is the scientific study of how humans think, feel, and behave. So it's scientific. We're going to rely on measurement and observation. And furthermore, in modern psychology, we're going to try to see how these functions can be related to different parts of the brain, different chemicals, different brain circuits, different interactive functions that are going on in our mind. Right? Now, the only problem with psychology is measuring the mind is kind of hard. I mean, really, how much does your self-esteem really weigh? Or what color is love? You know, it's very bizarre thinking about how to measure these things called thoughts and ideas. Now, all of you have grown up in the 21st century, and so you've been taking IQ tests and personality surveys and other kinds of tests. So for you, measuring the mind isn't such a surprising or new thing. But in the 19th century, in the mid-1800s, nobody had ever really thought about measuring the mind, right? So your book's going to talk about some fellows that are quote, fathers or leaders in the field of psychology, and I'm going to add one to them. So there are three people who are really important in the founding of psychology as a science. The first is a fellow named Gustav Fechner. And the reason he's important is because he was the first guy to demonstrate to everybody's satisfaction that the mind could actually be systematically measured. Again, you folks have grown up in the age of IQ tests, but this is before IQ tests were born. This is before personality tests were born. This is before anybody really knew what the mind was about. And so Gustav Fechner was the first person to measure the mind. And he created this thing, he discovered this thing he called the just noticeable difference. It turns out there's a very systematic relationship between the amount of change that occurs in stimuli and your ability to perceive those changes. And he was sort of the father of what we might call sensation and perception. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 5, which is in 2 weeks. He was the first to measure the mind. Without Gustav Fechner, we don't have a science. We are still a philosophy of mind. So that's why he's important. Now, your book's going to talk about another fellow as being very important in the field of psychology. They're going to talk about Wilhelm Wundt as being the father of psychology. And he's very important too. And that's because he was the first guy to ever to open a psychology lab and give away the first PhDs. Before Wilhelm Wundt, you couldn't be a psychologist. Gustav Fechner wasn't a psychologist, he was a physiologist. William James wasn't a psychologist, he was a philosopher. These gentlemen were not psychologists because psychology hadn't been invented in terms of being an official profession. Wilhelm Wundt in 1879 opened the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany, and handed out the first PhDs. He was also into sensation and perception research, and we'll talk about a little bit about him in chapter 5 as well. Now, the third fellow I want to introduce you to, your book also mentions him, but they don't talk about him the way I talk about him. William James is important because he wrote the first psychology textbook and really laid out a plan for the 20th century study of human functioning. He wrote this book called The Principles of Psychology. It was a 2-volume theory that was like 12 or 13 inches thick. It was a huge, obnoxiously big book. But this guy was the first to sort of lay the fundamentals of how we might create a science of the mind. He's often referred to as the American father of psychology. So for the exam, I want you to know what each 3 of these people contributed to the founding of psychology. Gustav Fechner was the first to measure the mind and made psychology a science. Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology lab and gave out the first official scientific degrees. And William James wrote the first textbook and provided a roadmap for the study of psychology in the 20th century. Any questions so far? I don't see my phone blowing up and I don't see any text in the top chat. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? Hopefully not. Okay, now here's the deal with studying the human being. Have you ever heard the joke of three blind men going up and touching an elephant, and they're all asked what an elephant is like, and the first guy on the back grabs the skinny tail and he says, wow, they're really small and thin like a snake. The second guy grabs the big foot and he says, wow, they're actually big and thick like tree trunks, right? And then the third guy grabs the elephant's snout and says, wow, they're actually like fire hoses, really strong and rubbery like fire hoses. What's the difference in all of these people's why do these people have different reasons or explanations for what an elephant is? And that's because an elephant is so big, they're all looking at it from different angles. So they're all seeing different parts of a very big thing. The study of human functioning is the same thing. There are literally dozens of different ways to study human functioning. You can study our social groups. You can study our brain. You can study how we think. You can study people's motivation. There are just different directions to approaching the study of human beings. In the first 50 years from 1850, actually let's say for the first 100 years, from 1850 to 1950, psychology struggled sort of to find, if you will, a soul. What is the best way? Exactly, KB is responding to my elephant question. He's talking about their perspective influencing their perception. Thank you, KB, for saying it better than I could have said it. The same is true with the study of human beings. Your direction, your perception influences what you find important about the human being. Now, your book in Table 1.1 kind of talks about some of the early approaches or perspectives, if you will, KB, on what humans were like. And these represented different individuals who were very early in the study of psychology who said, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should study human beings this way. And each of these schools of thought just represents a different perspective, KB. Does everybody understand how I'm building on KB's thought here? Very good point, Ken, right? And so there are multiple schools of thought, but there are really only three that I want you to know for the exam. All right. On the exam, I will ask you about these early approaches to psychology and the people associated with them. The early schools of psychoanalysis, the school of behaviorism, and the cognitive psychology approach, okay? Now, Sigmund Freud is probably the most famous of all psychologists, and it's not because he was the most important, but it's because he talked about sex. And everybody finds sex interesting. And so his early approach to human beings was the idea that, human beings are just like animals, and we are driven by motivations and desires and instincts, if you will. The instinct to eat, the instinct to have sex, the instinct to run away from dangerous things. And he argued on top of these instincts, we have evolved a mind and a society. And sometimes the mind and society are in direct conflict with our instincts. You may want to eat when it's inappropriate or have sex when it's inappropriate. And he argued that it is this fundamental conflict and these fundamental drives that are the best way to understand human beings' functionings. I don't know if that makes sense, but he developed his theories early in the 20th century, 1900 to 1920, and he thought that everybody was driven by the need to fulfill these sexual desires that we're not even aware of. And he argued that a lot of times we build in defense mechanisms when we can't deal with the anxiety that's created by our desires, right? So I don't know if any of you have heard of people who are projecting, or if you've ever heard anybody say, don't be defensive. What you're referring to is a Freudian mechanism for hiding our urges from our conscious awareness. Now, when we get to chapter 4, we're going to talk about a neo-Freudian named Erik Erikson. And he had a theory that argued that people's personality develops from conflict. Not necessarily sexual conflict, but as you move on in the field of psychology, all of you are going to have to be familiar with the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory of Erik Erikson. So we'll talk about that in chapter 4. But just remember, Sigmund Freud and his followers thought the most important way of understanding human beings was understanding our sexual urges and how we controlled them. All right. Now, Sigmund Freud didn't do a lot of measurement. And in fact, one of the terms that's used to sort of make fun of him is to call him an armchair psychologist. He was never in a lab. He just sat around in his office thinking about theories, okay? Now, the second approach to psychology came from the study of animals, the study of dogs, the study of cats, and the study of rats and pigeons. And if any of you have a dog or an animal that you have trained to do something, maybe you've trained it to go outside and use the bathroom outside of the house and not inside of the house. Maybe you've trained the dog to sit, to shake hands. Maybe you've trained your parakeet to sing a song. All of these learned behaviors represent one way of thinking about human beings. Are you really like a dog or a pigeon that has been really well trained? The second approach, early approach to studying human beings, looked at how our environment shaped our behavior. And it was led by a fellow named John Watson, who thought that really we were all blank slates, and the difference between people depended upon how their environment shaped them through rewards and punishment. Right? Those of you who like a sport probably were good at the sport. So when you played it, you were reinforced for it, and so you developed a liking for it. Some of you may have been really good students, and that's because when you did good things in school, people congratulated you and gave you candy and made you feel good about yourself. And so you decided that you liked school. You can actually trace back all of your preferences, a lot of the things you think and a lot of things that you do, to how you were rewarded or punished in your environment, right? And so the second approach to studying human beings was to look at how the environment shaped them. And I do want you to know that B.F. Skinner was the second rock star psychologist that everybody knows about. And he developed this thing called a Skinner box, which is basically the box where the rat presses the lever to get a piece of food. I'm sure all of you have seen that image before. And later on this semester, I'll even show you the Skinner box that I have in my office, because I've got an old school Skinner box, okay? And so that's the second early approach to studying psychology. Now, neither one of these approaches were official. Some people tended to focus on conflict, and they were psychoanalysts. Other people said, no, let's look at how the behavior is shaped by the environment. And then there was a third approach that occurred in the 1930s and early 40s, and it was really influenced by the invention of the computer. Now, a computer really is an electronic brain, right? You put information in one side, you have a program in the middle, which is a set of instructions to how to process that information, and then output comes out the other side, right? Isn't that how computers work? And you could think about the computer's brain as being the program, the operating system that runs that particular computer. Now, the first computer was invented in the late 30s, early 40s, and as soon as it was invented, people said, wow, we should think about human beings as being similar to computers in that they have instructions inside like operating systems. The third approach to psychology is called the cognitive school of thought. And the cognitive approach is interested in understanding how human beings process information. In short, they're interested in trying to figure out what your operating system is like. One of the earliest findings that we've discovered about the human mind is that you have a limited ability to keep a number of things in your mind at one time. I don't know if you've ever talked to a friend on the phone who's asked you to pick something up from the store, but if they give you more than 4 or 5 items, it's hard to remember everything they told you when you're going in the grocery store, right? How many of you could remember a list of 12 items to get at the grocery store without writing it down? I'll bet you couldn't. Well, it turns out this fellow named George Miller discovered that human beings, what he called digit span, or the number of things that they can keep in their short-term memory, is about 7 plus or minus 2. So people can generally remember from 5 to 9 grocery items walking in the store without having to write them down on a piece of paper. Now, cognitive psychologists study stuff like memory, attention, how we solve problems. Cognitive psychologists even try to explain how we develop and use language. So that's sort of the third broad approach to studying the human being. Does anybody have any questions so far? We're about 2/3 of the way into this lecture, so it looks like the timing's running pretty good. Any questions so far? Ken, Needy, Grace? Wow, we have an audience of 14 students. This is absolutely amazing. The live audience is fabulous. Thanks, everybody. I don't see any typing coming through, so it looks like we're doing well. Now, here's the thing. It turns out that that having broad general approaches didn't lead to a very effective way of developing this science, because we really didn't have standards for how psychologists could be developed. What represented a properly trained psychologist? Before the 1940s, anybody could just put a sign up and call themselves a psychologist. There were no standards. Now, with World War II and all of the soldiers coming home with brain damage and psychological trauma from the war and all of the stresses created by the rise of Nazism in World War II really created pressure on America's psychologists. So in the mid to late 40s, psychology began to reorganize itself using what they would call the medical model and sort of modeled itself on the medical profession. Now, you folks know that in the medical profession, you can be a doctor, but we're not just doctors. Everybody has a specialization. Some doctors are neurologists, some doctors are cardiologists, some doctors who do special and general medicine actually have to give themselves a name. They're called general practitioners, right? So everybody has an area of specialization, if you will. Now, there are similarities among all doctors. All doctors understand red blood cells, they understand the heart, they understand blood pressure, they understand medication, but they all have different specializations that they are really, really good at. And if you're a cardiologist, you're not allowed to go out and work on people's feet. You leave that to a podiatrist, right? And if you're a neurologist and somebody comes in with a urinary tract infection, you don't fix them, right? You send them to another doctor. In the same way, psychology has developed what we would call subfields of psychology. And this is how modern psychology is organized. So I will tell you that I'm not just a psychologist, I'm a social psychologist. And if you look here at table 1.2 in your psychology textbook, you'll see that social psychologists explore how people are affected by others. I am a group psychologist. It turns out people act one way when they're by themselves, but depending upon who they're around, their behavior radically changes. I study things like peer pressure, culture, and how people make decision making as groups. So I'm what you would call a social psychologist. My wife takes me to cocktail parties all the time, and people, when they find out I'm a psychologist, they laugh and they say, "Wow, you sure could help my family. We need somebody to fix our psychological problems." I never say it, but what they're actually talking about is a different subfield of psychology called a clinical psychologist. If you have a psychological problem and you need to get help for your bipolar or your depression or your anxiety, you don't go to a social psychologist, you go to a clinical psychologist. Does that make sense? Right? Now, there are literally 56 different areas of psychology out there. And if you'll look in your course resources, I've actually got a link to the divisions of the APA, and you can look through all of those 56 areas of specialization. And it turns out that all of those represent different kinds of diplomas that you can get. So my diploma says Doctor of Social Psychology. My friend Dave, who is a clinical psychologist, his diploma says Doctor of Clinical Psychology. There are over 50 different titles that you can have on your diploma. Now, for this class, I want you to be familiar with about the top 10. I'm not sure how many I have here, 3, 6, 9, 10, the top 11 areas of specialization or subfields in psychology. Actually, we're really going to focus on about 9 of these, right? And what I want you to understand is that each of these people has a different area of specialization. So a biological psychologist is going to be looking at how your brain structure and chemistry affects your functioning, right? A cognitive psychologist is actually a modern area of subfield. Turns out cognitive psychologists were so right that they turned them into an official subfield. And so cognitive psychologists are interested in understanding how people think and process information. Now, we actually have cognitive neuroscientists, and those are people who try to peg these mental functions to biological structures. It's kind of like the intersection of cognitive psychology and biological psychology. Now, I also teach developmental psychology, and developmental psychologists are interested in how our abilities change as we grow and age. So how does a 2-year-old think differently than a 4-year-old? And how does a 16-year-old think differently than a 35-year-old? These are all things that a developmental psychologist would be interested in. Health psychologists are those people that help us deal with stress and help us learn how to live happier, healthier lives. So if you want to learn about stress, when we get to chapter 11, we'll talk about health psychology, which is the area of psychology that is interested in helping you learn how to manage and deal with your feelings of stress. Personality psychologists are those people who are developing tests to measure your personality. This semester, we're going to take the Big 5 personality test, which measures the 5 dimensions of the healthy personality. We're also going to take the MMPI that measures extreme, rigid personality styles that may represent personality disorders. So we're going to take lots of tests, and these tests are developed by personality psychologists. Again, I'm a social psychologist functioning in group behavior. There are cultural psychologists who try to understand how culture changes people's basic psychological functioning. One way to think about human beings as immune to culture. We're all biological animals, so goes the biological perspective. So why should we be different based upon where we come from? It turns out that basic human biological and functional processes are affected by the cultures in which we are raised. All right, clinical psychologists, those are the people that help you when you are suffering from a psychological disorder. Okay, now in the educational psychologists are the people who help us research how we do teaching to help us educate people more effectively. And finally, if you really want to make money, you go to NC State and get an industrial organizational degree, psychology PhD, and you use what we know in psychology to help make the workplace more effective and more profitable for businesses. And so these are the basic ways that you can do psychology, basic subfields in psychology. Now, this week's discussion board is going to try to get you to appreciate the differences in these different areas of psychology, these different subfields, okay? These each represent different professional specialties. But the other thing I want you to understand is that sometimes people from these different subfields collaborate together on problems that are interesting to both of them or all three of them. So this week's TED Talk is by Deb Roy, and it's going to be a talk about a research study not actually done by a psychologist. And what I want you to do is to figure out which areas of specialization, which subfields would be interested in this talk. And this will be reflected in your homework assignment and in your discussion board assignment. Okay, one last point before I let you go. Whoa, excuse me, I went too far. I'll come back one time. All right. Quick note about where you'll find psychologists. Most everybody thinks that psychologists can only be found in clinical psychology, in clinical settings. It turns out that you will find psychologists everywhere. But what I want you to know is that about 50% of all psychologists are in the helping profession. So you see 25% you'll find in hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, in medical hospitals. 16% of them are going to be working in the same settings, but they'll be government VA medical centers. So you'll see about 40% of them are actually working in hospitals. And then you're going to see almost 6% are those people that will be in office buildings running private practices. So about 45 to 50% of all psychologists will be in the helping profession. And then I want you to see that the second largest group of psychologists is people like me, psychologists who are researchers or teachers trying to educate and learn more about psychological functioning. Well, that's really all I had to talk about this week. Just as a wrap up, I want you to know that psychology is scientific, and that's the reason it's scientific is because we use measurement and observation. And tomorrow's lecture is going to be all about measurement and observation in the field of psychology. I want you to know that modern psychology was born in the 19th century and who the three important founding fathers were, right? And then I want you to know how the three early psychologists approached the study of human beings, okay? And then I want you to know why psychology became professionalized in the 1940s. And I want you to be able to identify about 9 different areas of specialization. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Can I answer any questions for you? If you do, please don't hesitate to type them in. We're at 11:32, so I'm probably going to want to finish this up pretty soon. Okay, I don't see any questions. If you have any, text them and I can answer them for the group. You know what? It was really good seeing you. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope you found the lecture valuable. And I will see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Till then, take care, and I will see you tomorrow.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.